Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Glover Cottages. A welcome, of course, to our members, but I notice there are a lot of non-members here tonight, so I hope you will enjoy this evening and perhaps consider at the end of the evening joining our institute. You'd be most welcome. We have a very special guest tonight, of course, His Honour Michael Kirby. Now, really an introduction to Michael Kirby is superfluous. As you know, he was the Justice on the High Court of Australia and also on the Court of Appeal in New South Wales. So really what I ought to be saying is, all rise. And then we can get on with it. But actually there's a bit more to be said, because what perhaps isn't quite so well known is that Michael Kirby was on the Eminent Persons Group, which looked at the Commonwealth of Nations. That's the organisation that comprises many of the most important developing countries in the world, and who had their recent CHOGM meeting, Heads of Government meeting in Perth. And the Eminent Persons Group, as I said, on which Michael was a prominent member, made some very, very important recommendations as to the future of the Commonwealth. How can this organisation, which we all value and admire, how can it get more bite? How can it have more substance to it? How can it perhaps be more effective? And many of these recommendations were accepted by this Heads of Government meeting in Perth. And I know that Michael, who attended this meeting, was really quite pleased by the way it went, but the media didn't give it a huge amount of attention because I think Qantas was busy stranding some of the heads of government leaders in Perth at the time, and unfortunately it's a fact that when you have events in Perth, they tend not to get as well reported in the eastern states as they do if they take place in Sydney or Melbourne, which is a sad fact of life. So we've invited him here really to do two things. First of all, to tell us why these changes which are going to take place in the Commonwealth, including hopefully the appointment of a new executive in the Commonwealth Secretariat to deal with issues such as human rights and so on, how that played out and what he sees as being the future of the Commonwealth of Nations. And then secondly, to talk about two books which he's recently been involved in, one of which he's penned himself. So that really is enough of an introduction from me. So without any more ado, His Honour Michael Kirby.
Now tonight I'm going to be completely shameless. I am launching here amongst you two magnificent books. One of them is the report of the Eminent Persons Group of the Commonwealth. No one should go away without ordering one. It is a must-read. It must be available to everybody at Christmas. It is beautiful, it is interesting, it is valuable, and I'm going to tell you all about it, but not too much, because then you mightn't buy it. And the second book is a triumph. It's selling. It's so cheap, you know. I mean, it's sort of bargain giveaway prices. It's given recommended resale price is $35, which itself for a hard copy book, beautiful printing, marvellous photographs from all aspects of my early life. It's a steal. That's the only way you could, maybe a judge shouldn't describe, or even the next judge shouldn't describe it as a steal. But you can buy it in some bookshops for $29.95. It's already been discounted. Student shops, you know, because students don't have much money and therefore they've got to get it cheap. $29.95. Now look, what better present could you put in the Christmas stocking of an unsuspecting auntie who isn't expecting to read all about this? And there's a third book here, which is Professor A.J. Brown's biography of me. The man spent 7 years of his life. He went through mile after mile of archives in the National Archives. He had an intensive immersion in my life, and he came up with the somewhat surprising conclusion that I'm a paradox. Well, you're a paradox. Everybody's a paradox. What a bore it would be if everybody fulfilled somebody's preconceived, stereotypical view of how you should be. Well, I've got points of view and attitudes just like all of you, and that's A.J. Brown's book. It's unput-downable once you get into it. So, I mean, this is really a cornucopia tonight, a cornucopia of books that you must have for Christmas, and I am here to sell them to you. Well, it's no good clapping, you've got to buy. The Eminent Persons Group was a very interesting group of people. It was 10 senior citizens of the Commonwealth. There's only been one earlier Eminent Persons Group, and that was 25 years ago, and Malcolm Fraser was on that, and that was investigating the issues concerned with Southern Africa and how we would get a transition from the apartheid regime into the multi-racial democracy of South Africa. And so we were the second Eminent Persons Group. It was set up pursuant to a resolution which was passed by the previous Heads of Government Conference in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, and at that meeting, in the closing hours of it, the British government, the then Gordon Brown government, in the closing hours of their government, concluded that there should be an inquiry into how to make the Commonwealth more suitable to the 21st century. It was beginning to show its age. It was beginning to look a bit like a sort of remnant of empire. Many people still call it the British Commonwealth, but it's not the British Commonwealth. It hasn't been the British Commonwealth since 1949. It's the Commonwealth of Nations, signalling that it's a voluntary association of countries that come together in this association freely and voluntarily because they consider it's in their interest to do so. You all know how the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, morphed into the Commonwealth of Nations. It happened in a rather British sort of a way, actually, because after the Second World War, the links that bound the empire together began to get a bit frayed. Britain had spent enormously in blood, treasure, manpower in the war, and it was exhausted. And countries of the old empire began to assert their independence. One of them was Ireland. Now, Ireland had been a dominion within the Commonwealth, just like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, between 1923 and 1949. But in 1948, they enacted a piece of legislation to make Ireland a republic, though they didn't bring it into force immediately. And that sort of hung as a spectre over the Commonwealth Prime Ministers' meetings, as they were called in those days. Then Burma, on the independence of India and Burma, Burma declared itself a republic. And because up to that time the cement that kept the empire together was allegiance to the crown, Burma just walked out because everyone accepted that you couldn't be a member of the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, unless you were showing allegiance to the crown of Britain. and Ireland indicated it was going to do exactly the same thing. It brought into force the Republican Constitution, and so Ireland also left the British Commonwealth. And India, the jewel in the crown, said that it also wished to accept and embrace a republican form of government. Now that led to a very deep conversation between Clement Attlee, who was then the British Prime Minister, having replaced Winston Churchill in 1945, as you remember, in the post-war election, almost post-war, and Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India. And so they got together, and over a period of 2 days they hammered out what was actually a very clever lawyer's solution to the problem of allegiance. Namely, that countries could be accepted by other countries in the Commonwealth of Nations if they accepted the sovereign of the United Kingdom as the head of the Commonwealth, but without any allegiance. They might retain allegiance or they might throw off allegiance, but they had to accept the head of the British monarchy as the head of the Commonwealth. And so that was the arrangement. The other prime ministers present in London in early 1949 accepted the Attlee-Nehru deal, and the consequence was a new foundation was created for the Commonwealth of Nations. And the foundation was twofold: voluntary and agreed, with a background of linkage to the old British Empire, but on a new footing of accepting the head of state of Britain as the head of the Commonwealth. And India did that, and so it became the first republic in the Commonwealth of Nations, and one by one other countries of Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of the empire became members of the Commonwealth. At the moment there are 54 members of the Commonwealth of Nations. One of them, the Fiji Islands, is suspended because of the fourth coup which overthrew the elected government in the Fiji Islands. So there are 53 active members of the Commonwealth. Of the 53, 16 are so-called realms. That's to say they accept the Queen as their head of state, as well as the head of the Commonwealth. That's Australia's position. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and a number of Caribbean states are in that category. But most are republics within the Commonwealth. Now the Commonwealth, the Queen has declared, is the original internet. It's an interconnected body with a large number of civil society organisations, actually 90 Commonwealth civil society organisations, most of them having some office in London, an association with the Secretariat of the Commonwealth of Nations. The Secretariat is housed in Marlborough House, which was the gift of the British government to the Duke of Marlborough for his part in the defeat of Napoleon. And Marlborough House is in Pall Mall in London, and it's a royal palace. And if you go in there, the walls are all decorated in exactly the way it was when Queen Mary died, with all the murals and so on of the battles of Marlborough in Marlborough House. So this is the Secretariat, this is the Commonwealth, but who knows about it? Who's heard about it? Who knows what it does? My niece, Jessica, who's studying government at the University of Sydney, told me that she was actually rather ashamed of the Commonwealth of Nations because she thought it's simply the remnant of the British Empire, which was a highly oppressive, wicked oppression of the colonial peoples all around the world, and that I should have nothing whatever to do with it. I should be thoroughly ashamed of myself for being involved in it, and she didn't know why I'd wasted my time. So I had to sit down with her and go back to basics and tell her if the Commonwealth didn't exist, it'd have to be invented, because here are 50-odd countries that have a common language, which language is now the intercontinental global language. They have common institutions. They don't always live up to the ideals of the institutions, but they have the ideal of an elected democracy in Parliament, of independent courts, of judges who are uncorrupted. They have the courthouses, the post offices, all the public buildings that were built during the time of empire. They have an infrastructure. And these are mighty things in common. And in a world where everything is split and divided, this is a force which brings countries together, and countries on an intercontinental basis. And moreover, as the Queen pointed out in her speech at Chockham in Perth, it's a commonwealth of peoples. It's not just a commonwealth of governments, it's a commonwealth of people who are linked together, and such a body, which now constitutes 2.1 billion people, which is 1/3 of humanity. It's an enormously important potential servant of humanity. But it has some problems. It has the problems that it doesn't always live up to its values. It endlessly says it's a values-based organisation. At the end of every Chockham meeting there is a marvellous declaration which is subscribed to by all of the heads of government. That declaration asserts that the Commonwealth stands for freedom, independence, justice and all of that, but when it comes to a crunch and a test is presented, as is presently happening in Sri Lanka, the organisation doesn't really walk the walk. It talks the talk, but it doesn't always walk the walk. And so that, I think, was what was in the minds of those at Port of Spain who said we need a second eminent persons group to look at the Commonwealth and to see how we can make it more prominent, more known by its people, more suitable for younger people, and more in tune with the ethos of the current age. And I was nominated by Stephen Smith, who was then the Foreign Minister, to be a member of it. And because Australia was the host for the Perth Chockham, to which we were expected to report, it was then inevitable that I would be appointed, as I was. The chair of the group was Tun Abdullah Badawi. He was the Prime Minister of Malaysia who succeeded Dr. Mahathir. And he proved to be rather laid back, but quite a good bringer together of the 10 members of the group. The other members of the group included Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who was no slouch. He had been the British Foreign Secretary for the whole of the period that the redoubtable Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. So anybody who could last the whole period with Maggie was a person of some substance. So we saw a lot of signs of that, particularly in Perth, as I'll tell you in a minute. Senator Hugh Segal, a senator in the government parties in Canada, was a very able and energetic member of the group. Ms. Asma Jahangir, who is a human rights lawyer and the president of the Bar of Pakistan, was a member of the group, and so was Patricia Francis, who is the head of the United Nations agency in Geneva. So all of these people, 10 of us, got together. We had 5 meetings, 4 of them in London, 1 of them in Malaysia as guests of Tun Badawi, and we decided at the very first meeting that we would write our own report, because I don't know if many of you spend your days, poor wretches, reading the reports of the United Nations or of the Commonwealth of Nations. If you do, they are a marvellous antidote to insomnia, because they are very difficult to read, and they're written in a sort of special bureaucratic speak. So we wrote our own, and already I've had wonderful compliments about the beauty of the phraseology of this book. Lots of full stops. You know, that's what I learned from Lord Denning when I was a young law student. Put in full stops. It's the language of the evangelist. It means it's a language of action, and that's what this report is. Now, we came up with 106 recommendations. They were all unanimous. We agreed that if we couldn't get unanimity, we would pass it by, and it wouldn't be a part of our report. And the unanimous recommendations included 4 that were absolutely central to the proposal. One of the 4 was that we should adopt and have a charter of Commonwealth values, so that for the future the values of the Commonwealth would not be what the heads of government give the people out of the generosity of their hearts, but would be fundamental principles of the Commonwealth to which governments and heads of government could be made accountable and rendered answerable before the bar of the Commonwealth and of the international community. Secondly, we recommended changes in CMAG. Now, CMAG is one of those awful acronyms which refers to the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, CMAG. And that is the group which, between CHOGMs, another horrible acronym, which is the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, runs the Commonwealth. It's fundamentally the foreign ministers of 6 or 7, I think it is, members of the Commonwealth who are elected at the CHOGM to run the Commonwealth between meetings. And it doesn't have to include any country. The United Kingdom, for example, is not at the moment a member of CMAG. So no country has a guaranteed place, and the problem has been that CMAG has become pretty good at dealing with coups and overthrow. If you overthrow an elected government, you're suspended. I mean, that didn't always happen. They used to have coups in Nigeria, and yet the leader of the coup, and Idi Amin, even came along to CHOGM meetings. But now that doesn't happen. If you overthrow an elected government, electoral democracy is one of the key principles of the Commonwealth, and if you overthrow, you're out, at least for the duration. That's what's happened to Fiji at the moment, and was threatened in Zimbabwe, but Zimbabwe got the message and left, and so it's out of the Commonwealth by its own decision. But the recommendation of the group was that CMAG has got to get better in dealing with human rights issues, because human rights issues plague the Commonwealth, and then when they happen, they tend to bring a bad odium on the Commonwealth as a whole. Take, for example, Sri Lanka at the moment, and that very disturbing program, which I'm sure a number of you saw, relating to the last days of the civil war against the Tamil Tigers. Definitely one of the most hateful group of terrorists that ever walked the earth. They were really cruel and barbaric, and unfortunately in a war against them all sorts of terrible things happened. But at the very end, it is alleged the government of Sri Lanka requested that the remnants of the Tamil Tigers should move into 2 areas of northern Sri Lanka where they were promised safe haven, and where it was said the whole area would be demobilised and the war would be brought to a conclusion. Instead, so it's alleged, the 2 areas were strafed, bombed, and entered by murderous government forces who killed large numbers, and a lot of this, in the manner of the current age, was recorded on film, and this has been the subject of a demand that there be a United Nations inquiry, but the government of Sri Lanka wouldn't accept a United Nations or an independent inquiry. It set up its own, but that hasn't proved satisfactory to many countries of the world, including Canada, which protested against the fact that the next CHOGM meeting is destined to be in Colombo, Sri Lanka. So it's problems of this kind that led the Eminent Persons Group to a third recommendation, which was that there be a commissioner, effectively a commissioner for human rights, who would have a responsibility to investigate and assist, give advice, give educative and other recommendations to member states, but where things are bad, to make sure that those errors are brought to notice and that some action is taken by CMAG. CMAG, you see, includes people who themselves may have human rights problems, and therefore there's a tendency in a community like that not to want to tread on somebody's toes, because next time they might be treading on your toes. I mean, Australia wouldn't be completely immune from CMAG. Look at the way we deal with refugees, which cannot be consistent with the Refugees Convention and Protocol. How can it be consistent with a protocol that we've signed and ratified, which, by which a country promises to respect a person coming to the country for refugee status, and then send them somewhere else, offshore, and then redefine Australia so that somewhere else is not part of the country, or even suggest that they be sent to Malaysia, which is not a party to the Refugees Convention. I mean, these are things that cannot be consistent, and we might find ourselves before the bar of CMAG, and if we had a Human Rights Commissioner, that would be just the way it would be done. But unfortunately, a lot of the countries in Perth didn't like the idea of a Human Rights Commissioner. They talked of the Human Rights Commissioner being a great big policeman of the Commonwealth, and they didn't think that was a good look. In fairness, Mr Rudd, who was chairing the Foreign Ministers' meeting, which we were allowed in to watch, tried to get things moving on these proposals, but he struck a number of countries, including countries you wouldn't have expected. India, for example, which you think of as a country, the greatest democracy on earth. But they didn't want to have this. They said, we don't need this. And South Africa, the people from South Africa, Mr Zuma and the like, would be still locked up if it weren't for the fact that the Commonwealth had taken such a strong stand against apartheid. And yet they were opposed to it. To his credit, the Prime Minister of the Maldives spoke up, and he said, I was imprisoned by the regime we had in the Maldives for 31 years, of a dictator, and I used to write to the Commonwealth Secretariat and I never get a reply. And I think the idea of a Human Rights Commissioner is a very good idea. But that didn't really grab the heads of government there, and so that wasn't accepted. The other recommendation, which was, I think, crucial, was one which I had quite a part in, which related to the issue of AIDS in the Commonwealth. In the Commonwealth, the figures that we received from UNAIDS indicated that HIV in Commonwealth countries was double the rate of HIV in non-Commonwealth countries. Now, why should that be so? One of the explanations, a partial explanation, was that many of the laws that the British gave the colonies, that are now independent countries of the Commonwealth, had a big problem with sex. The British had a big difficulty in dealing with sex, which the French in their colonies and the Spanish and the Portuguese never had the same problem. The British bequeathed a most unlovely provision, which was never a feature of the other countries, of the Netherlands, and this was the anti-homosexual laws. They are still in force in 41 of the 54 countries of the Commonwealth of Nations. And if you stigmatise and penalise people, and you frighten them and criminalise them, then they're not going to be amenable to the messages that are essential for the protection of themselves, and thereby for the protection of society, and that was one of the very important lessons that we learned in Australia very early in the AIDS epidemic, thanks to two wonderful politicians. We don't often have wonderful politicians, but these two were wonderful politicians. Neil Blewett, the Minister for Health in the Hawke government, and Peter Bone, the coalition spokesman on health, at the same time. They agreed we've just got to do some strong and brave things, and it was they who got rid of the last of the laws, helped to get rid of the last of the laws against homosexuals, modified and changed the laws against sex workers, prostitutes, introduced the needle exchange system. We have, with New Zealand, the lowest rate of HIV amongst injecting needle users, injecting syringe users, of any countries in the world. And New Zealand has 1% of their injecting population has HIV. We have 2%. But in Canada, it's 18%, and in the United States, it's 33%. And these are the direct way. You can't have a better and more efficient way to get HIV than to inject the virus straight into your bloodstream. And that is what we faced up to, and we took some brave decisions. It was a time when our politicians did take good decisions. So these are the recommendations which the Eminent Persons Group put forward. There was a recommendation on new members of the Commonwealth, because that's a very untransparent process. There was a recommendation, which I was strongly for, to have a better system of visas within Commonwealth countries, or visa-free entry. It's very, very hard for an Australian to get into India. I know, because I was invited to give the Rajiv Gandhi lecture in New Delhi by the government of India, and I had to go down to the Consulate General here, and I sat there for 2 hours, but when I got to the counter, I was told, "Oh no, you have the wrong form. You have to have a form for a conference visa, not for a business visa. You have to get the approval of the federal authorities and the state authorities of the state where the conference is being held." And it's unkindly suggested that this is done by India to Australia, because Australia does exactly the same to everybody getting into Australia. And a lot of people who wanted to go to Choggum for the civil society meetings couldn't get in because they couldn't get visas to come to Australia. So we're not perfect in these matters by any means ourselves. Anyway, that's what we recommended. It went to Choggum. In fairness, the Choggum accepted about 42 of the recommendations, and 42 others were sent off to the foreign ministers to be considered. The proposal for a commissioner has not been killed, but it's gone off to the foreign ministers, and I don't like the look of what's going to happen there. The recommendation on HIV/AIDS, which is desperately urgent because people are dying about this, was sent off to the foreign ministers, and they don't get to consider it until next September, by which time a lot more people will be infected and a lot of people will die. So this is what's happened. It's partly good news, partly bad news, very typical Commonwealth story. But there wasn't really the energy that one would have hoped from the efforts of the EPG. And I think a lot of people just take the Commonwealth for granted. And what we have to do if we're to save this unique international body, it's the only international body where the heads of government go away for a retreat and no officials, and they just talk to each other, because they can talk in the English language, they can talk with common assumptions because of the fact that they share so many institutional arrangements, and that is something that is unique, and it's something that is very valuable, and this is what we recommended. We put out proposals before to strengthen the Commonwealth, and I don't think that some of the key parts of our proposals, especially the Commissioner, is going to be accepted. Now, the other book is tied into the Choggum effort in two particular respects, I think. First, the first chapter in the book is a chapter that describes my schooling. You know, the Jesuits were not too wrong when they said if you get a child by the age of 7, you can give them the values which remain with them all their life. Well, I went to public schools. I was the only justice on the High Court of Australia, this was remarkable, at least to me, whose entire education was in public schools. I'm not against private schools, I'm not against religious schools. I think a bit of competition is a good thing, though I do think in recent times we've given too much money, especially federal money, to private schools and not enough money to public schools. We've got to invest in public education. It's vital. Whether you have children or grandchildren at private schools, doesn't matter. It's in the interest of our country to strengthen the public system. Anyway, I describe in here how I had wonderful teachers. I get so angry when I hear people, including people who should know better, saying there are no values in public schools. I had the values of democracy, of equality, and of secularism, which were very important values to me. And if I wrote a very good essay, I describe this in my book, Miss Pontifex, my first teacher, or Mrs. Godwin, my teacher in 3rd year, would give me a reward, and she would take out a little stamp she had, and the stamp was the crown of St. Edward, and she would put it in the red, and she'd put it either on the book, or if I was very, very good, she would put it on my hand. And I would take it home to show my mother, look what I got this time. And I think the values I got in those days of respect for our institutions were very profoundly influential on me. And some of those values were values of respect for features of the British ideas of liberty, of democratic parliaments, of uncorrupted judges. Very important features. Just look at Egypt at the moment and look at other countries and see the difference. Ours is by no means perfect. I'm not a person, my whole life has been as a reformer, but I think when you have strong institutions, you can reform within that framework. And anyway, that's an influence that's affected the way I look at institutional questions. And the other aspect of the book is concerned with sexuality and HIV/AIDS, and tells the story of how I came to my own discovery of my sexuality as a homosexual man, and how that wasn't a really good look at the time. That was a very bad journey to come to. But fortunately we've got a bit better, and partly I think because of Dr. Alfred Kinsey and his investigation into human sexuality. Everyone talked about it, but no one actually did the research. But Kinsey was the man, because Kinsey was the world's greatest expert on bees. Did you know that? He was a world expert on gall wasps, and he had 2 million gall wasps which he'd investigated, and he was a great taxonomist. And so he turned his skills in taxonomy from bees into human beings, and that led to his discovery that human sexuality isn't binary, that it is on a spectrum, that people at different stages of their lives have different forms of love and affection, and that a certain proportion of people are exclusively homosexual, and that's about 4%, not 10%, as some gay groups say, and that's just it. And it's like left-handedness. Hand up all the people in this audience who are left-handers. Look at you all, disgusting. Really disgusting. Well, you're 11%. You're 11%. My brother Donald was left-handed, and they tried to make him write with his right hand, because in those days, and I described this beautifully in the first chapter, in those days we had 2 things. We had slope cards, which gave you the slope, which I still have. It's in my DNA, I think, that slope. The beauty of writing a capital C on the correct angle, up and down. Oh, I think even now I think it's beautiful. But we also had inkwells, and we put our nib. You remember the nibs? You had to lick the nib first to give it cohesion, to take the ink. If you just put a new nib on, it wouldn't take the ink. But if you sucked it, it would then take the ink and then it would write. And if you write with your left hand, then you're writing and your hand is going over the ink. And so they tried to make him, and my mother went up to the school and she said, "Don't you dare try to change Donald to be a right-hander. If God had meant him to be a right-hander, he would have made him be a right-hander." And they stopped. But the opposition to the left hand also goes back to the Bible. A lot of things go back to the Bible. The left hand was the hand of the devil, and it's an evil, sinister, the Latin word for left, and it's not a good look to be a left-hander, according to some passages in the Bible, and similarly the passages in the Bible have been thrown at the gays. Well, that gave me that experience, and I explained how that led on to my involvement in the AIDS epidemic and people I've met there. There's a particularly pathetic chapter about my infatuation with James Dean, which came because in those days, I was about 20, and you just were supposed to spend your whole life as a lonely person. I mean, it's pathetic that this was done to human beings. It's wicked that it was done, and it still would be done by some people, especially some religious people. They've got to really go back to their fundamentals and think about what the fundamentals of religion are, and the fundamentals of all religions are: love one another. And that means you've got to love them, not just love selectively. Anyway, that's a very sad chapter. You'll need your Kleenex when you're reading that chapter. And it finishes up with a sort of explanation of what it's like to be getting older. I don't say old because I don't accept that I'm getting old, but I am getting a little bit older, and that's explained in the very last chapter. So it's not an autobiography because it's not the whole works. That is going to come in due course. Well, you can laugh, but this book, it's sold out. I mean, you've got to be quick to get this book. This is going to be a cult legend, this book. And people will say in 50 years' time, "Have you got that book?" And you will be proud if tonight, at this desk here, you buy the book. And if you've got money over, you can buy the A.J. Brown book. That's more heavy going, but it's got a terrific chapter on the horrible attack on me by Senator Heffernan, which has been researched by A.J. Brown through FOI requests. He got a lot of information that I didn't know. I was the last person to know what on earth was going on. We were in the middle of a case in the High Court on effluent, on the effect of effluent in the Brisbane waters on the oysters, and it had made people sick, and they were suing all sorts of people. And so I just kept on with the effluent case while there was a bit of effluent going on outside. So, there you are. I mean, have I given you a good resume, enough to tempt you? There's no point you coming along and giving a round of applause. I want you to buy. Okay. Well, now we'll have a Q&A. Q&A, yes. Look, that's a very bad start.
My eminent other guest will ask you more questions than I, but I own a small real estate agency, and I want you as a salesman working for
You're on. I'm out of work. I mean, I've left.
Got a job. Come and work for me. You are the best salesman.
You think? Oh, good. Well, we're on. We will have a private discussion later. Terms. Start thinking terms. Okay. Yes.
You touched briefly on new membership of the Commonwealth. When I was a small boy, I collected colourful stamps, and particularly the British Commonwealth. I was terribly disappointed that Mozambique was not a member of the British Commonwealth because it had the most colourful stamps going around. Mozambique now is a member of the British Commonwealth. Why? And if Mozambique is acceptable, what about for example, Kyrgyzstan, Albania, Rwanda, other countries that may benefit from Commonwealth membership?
Well, first of all, Mozambique is a member of the Commonwealth for no reason other than the fact that Graça Machel, the widow of the president of Mozambique, who was killed in a plane crash, who was a very close friend of Nelson Mandela and subsequently his wife, wanted Mozambique to be a member of the Commonwealth, and so did Nelson. And what Nelson asked for, Nelson got, because he was a man of the most profound respect in the Commonwealth countries, rightly so. It wasn't a terribly transparent process, and it was followed by a similar request at the same time of Cameroon. Now, at least Cameroon, which borders Nigeria, had been a condominium of Britain and France, and so they had a sort of distant link to the United Kingdom, though their language, the common language, was French. But Cameroon was admitted, and subsequently Rwanda, which never had any link whatsoever with Britain, was admitted at the last CHOGM, the one in Port of Spain. And this was something that concerned some members of the group, including myself, because once you start breaking down the commonalities, the danger is you're just transplanting into this body the geopolitical frameworks that exist in the United Nations, and we don't need to repeat that. That's not a good look. So one of the recommendations of the group was that the proposed commissioner should vet applications for membership to make sure that the country coming in will have a true allegiance no longer to a crown but to the values that are really central to the Commonwealth. I would think we're likely to get an application, if it isn't already in, from southern Sudan. Now, at least southern Sudan will be a country that was also a condominium. The Anglo-Egyptian Sudan was a condominium of Egypt and Britain. But that wasn't before the Perth CHOGM. I suspect that'll be before the CHOGM in Colombo in 2 years' time. There are some rather strange applications rumoured, because you don't get to know exactly who has applied. It's suggested that Palestine and Israel have applied. Each of them was at some stage ruled by the United Kingdom. I think under a mandate. I think they were mandated territories, which became trusteeships for a short time and then no longer. But that hasn't happened. Aden and Yemen are other countries that have said to have applied. But Georgia, you talked about Azerbaijan or Kyrgyzstan, but Georgia is understood to have actually made an application. You know that they've got the president who is an American Georgian, and they've apparently applied. People want to get into the Commonwealth because it has lots of activities and things in common, but many of them are built on the commonalities of language and experience of having gone through the whole business of British rule, and with the good and the bad elements that come of that. So I'm with you. I don't think it's a good look to replicate the geopolitics of the world. You've got that in the United Nations. But that's where that stands.
What about Ireland?
Ireland. Well, because my forebears came from Ireland, I was very keen, the Queen having gone to Ireland and having had a very successful visit to Ireland, that might be something that it would be suitable to raise. But Sir Malcolm Rifkin, who's a pretty smart cookie about these things, said, well, there's no problem whatsoever of Britain or any of the Commonwealth countries with Ireland coming back. They have all the accoutrements, and they have a democratic country with a wonderful independent court system and so on. But he thought the initiative has to come from Ireland because of the troubles and the difficulties of the past, and that therefore it might actually be disadvantageous to take an initiative, and so he suggested that we just leave that to take its course. But if it did happen, if Ireland sought to rejoin the Commonwealth, because it was a member of the Commonwealth, it was a member of the British Commonwealth, if it sought to rejoin the Commonwealth, there would be no obstacle whatever. Yes.
My name's Tom, and I'm Senior. The question is, how do you think the Commonwealth needs to change to remain relevant?
Well, it has to be more evident. It has to be much more media savvy. For example, when the Channel 4 film, which we saw in Australia on Four Corners on Sri Lanka, was shown, the Secretary-General said nothing. And ultimately I sent letters, and no doubt mine were some of many, but because I was an EPG member, they were responded. But anyway, within days, he made a statement saying that the importance of Commonwealth values and that an independent inquiry was important and so on. But I don't think the present Secretary-General is very media savvy or media comfortable. He's a very intelligent man. He was an Indian diplomat. He is very well-read and very learned. But my own view is that, other things being equal, you do better in a job like that to choose a politician or an ex-politician. They tend to be people who know how the world works, who've had to live in the 24-hour news cycle, who now know that inferences are drawn if you don't say anything, that you don't have anything to say, and who are willing sometimes to take risks. People whose background has been officialdom tend to be very risk-averse, and I think that this is why, generally speaking, the most successful Secretaries-General of the Commonwealth have been people who were politicians. Sonny Rompal, for example, was a politician in Guyana, and Don McKinnon was a politician in New Zealand. People like that are generally better than people whose background is official life. Yes?
You touched on human rights. What's your view on the benefits or otherwise of an Australian Bill of Rights?
Well, I'm for a bill. I mean, we're in one of the very few countries now that doesn't have a Bill of Rights, and we're constantly told we don't need it because our parliaments are so lightning quick. They are so efficient in the way they deal with every problem in society. They're just sitting there waiting for every problem of society to come in, and they fix it up. And we don't need a Bill of Rights. Well, now, myself, in my judicial life, I was always respectful of Parliament. I always upheld where I could the role of Parliament, and I do think, in principle, it's generally better to have the people's representatives solving problems if they will. But last week I had to go to a conference in Melbourne on the law of privacy, and in the wake of the stories of the Murdoch press and the hacking of phones and the invasions of privacy, there's a lot of talk about why don't we have a law of privacy? Why don't we have a... Now, I remember that when I was chair of the Law Reform Commission back in 1979, I think it was, we delivered a report which recommended a graduated tort, a statutory right of action in privacy. And then that wasn't acted on because the press, the media, didn't like it. If you don't have anything to discipline you, you much prefer that. If you're powerful, and that nothing got done. Then secondly, there was another inquiry by the Law Reform Commission in the 1990s, and it recommended that there be a protection for privacy and a statutory right of action, and nothing got done. And then now Mr. Brendan O'Connor, the Minister for Privacy, interestingly, has issued an issues paper. So it's an issues paper on the report on the report. And this is since 1979. This is a real problem in Australia. Sitting down and actually analysing the issues, and as a politician taking the responsibility and deciding the matter, that's how democracy is supposed to work. But nobody wants to take decisions anymore. And in that environment, it sometimes is helpful to have courts which, by the way, are amenable to ordinary folks who can bring actions in courts to independent officials to get some attention to issues. It's a question of whether you want to hand over all the problems of society to parliaments which don't always do much about it, and to parliamentary party whips and party organisations which control the operation of Parliament, or whether you want to supplement that with the stimulus that courts can give. Most countries have opted for that. We haven't. Why we haven't? Because Parliament is so perfect. Well, it isn't perfect, and we need to help it, and the system that has been adopted in New Zealand and Britain is of a parliamentary capacity to overturn anything that the courts say on this. It's not as if the judges have the right to strike things down. They merely have the right to say this is in breach of the Bill of Rights, and that way it's hoped that would stimulate the parliamentary process. So far from damaging Parliament, the model was supposed to help Parliament, but it didn't even get to first base. It was ruled out by Mr. Rudd, and we still don't have it. Right up the back.
Michael, you're more than an eminent person in Australia. We're proud to have you nonetheless. The question, why does Australia sell itself out as an immature nation? We've had Australians with the problem with Hicks, and we didn't defend him. We now have a problem with Assange, and we are not defending him. Why do we cower in the face of the might of the USA?
Well, politicians are strange beasts, as you know, and they do tend to try to be responding to people to make everybody happy, because then if they're happy, they'll vote for them. In fairness to, in the case of Mr. Assange, I think Prime Minister Gillard said something about removing the passport, but I think Mr. Rudd insisted that Mr. Assange would be given all the entitlements to consular assistance of an Australian who's overseas. So I think sometimes politicians are confronted with a microphone shoved under their nose and said, well, what are you going to do about Mr. Assange? And the politician may not really know much about Mr. Assange, and they say things which considered opinion doesn't really support. I'm sorry? He is Australian, of course he is, and he's entitled to the protection of consular assistance. He's not entitled to have Australia necessarily embrace everything he says or does. And that matter is going through the English courts, which you know gave Mr. Assange liberty on bail on condition that he lives in a castle with somebody who's made the castle available to him. So that matter is going ahead, and I see that WikiLeaks won one of the big awards at the prize for journalism in the last few days. And there's no doubt, I've spoken at a big conference in Sydney of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and there's no doubt that the majority of ordinary Australians and professional Australians seem to be on Mr. Assange's side and think that what he did is a good thing. But there is another point of view, and that is that he's damaged the capacity of officials to speak candidly to government, and that everyone now must assume that what they're going to say is going to be released. Yes?
Corruption is a single mother of poverty, terrorism, human abuse, AIDS issue. What is Commonwealth doing, or Commonwealth doing to tackle corruption issue? 90% of global participants are totally corrupt, or not in the countries, but what is Commonwealth doing? I think it's essential to have Commissioner for Corruption than for human rights.
Well, anti-corruption is a form of human rights protection, because if you don't have uncorrupted courts and uncorrupted officials, you can have all the wonderful principles, but you won't get delivered what is essential. So that I agree with you that these are important. In fact, the report tried to balance the matters which were of concern to the older members of the Commonwealth, the developed and richer members of the Commonwealth, which were the human rights aspects, with the concerns of the newer members of the Commonwealth, which were global climate change, because many of them are small states, many of them island states. 31 of the Commonwealth members are small island states, and they are at danger, an existential danger of disappearing under the water. So the report does deal with development issues, with poverty issues, and with issues of climate change and so on. Corruption is bound up in the job of making the institutions work better, and that is definitely something that the report deals with a lot.
Got time for just one more question.
Yes.
Justice Kirby from Shannon from New South Wales, AAA New South Wales Council. Your speech tonight was fantastic, it was riveting. The report was unforgettable. I wanted to quickly ask you what your advice would be to young people or to even a broader group who are passionate about issues that are controversial or that are difficult to speak about. What would your advice be to young people getting their voice out on those issues?
Well, one of the suggestions, and it actually came from Tun Badawi, was that we should have a Commonwealth Youth Corps, and that should be able to use and support young members in the Commonwealth who constitute something like 40% of the 2.3 billion people in the Commonwealth, to get to spend a period of volunteer work. There is, of course, in Australia, AVI, the Australian Volunteers International, which sends a lot of young Australians into countries overseas to spend part of their time just before, just after graduation, to get experience and to see the world. My advice is simple. Be a joiner. Join. Get involved. I was always a joiner. I joined the student societies and the SRC, and I found, strangely enough, to my own surprise, my grades went up. I was happy. I wasn't just at home sort of feeling sorry for myself. I was involved in a lot of things, and I was, as Chief Justice Gleeson said on my departure from the Court of Appeal, I became the greatest juggernaut of student politics that Australia has ever seen, until Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard came along. But then I joined the Council for Civil Liberties, and I got involved with them, and they're still operating, the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. And this institute, you're a joiner, you're here tonight, so you've started on the path. Your life will be ruined, you realise that. You'll end up working 7 days a week, you'll be flat out doing everything, and you've got to be very lucky to get a good partner who'll put up with you. But if you do that, and you're a joiner, and you're involved, and you're dedicated to try and make the world a better place. So many cynics in this world, and we can make a contribution. In my life, look what I've seen. We've begun to respect, we haven't got there entirely, the Aboriginal people. We denied them the vote. We denied them the right to their land rights. We were really terrible in our treatment of the Indigenous people. Similarly with white Australia, until 1966 we didn't let people, even if they were married overseas, they couldn't bring a partner here if they were not Caucasian. And I grew up in that at Fort Street High School, where I was in my youth. There were, in the whole school of I think 600 boys, there were 10 Asian Australians. When I go back now, it's 40 or 50% of the school are Asian Australians. And it's a great change that's come about, but that has happened in my life. Similarly with gays. I mean, gays were criminals, and you threw away the key, and everyone hated them, and it was so irrational. Well, we've made some progress. We've got rid of the criminal laws. My partner now gets a pension if I choke on one of your canopies tonight. But we still don't have marriage, and there's serious talk about equality of people in the dignity of their relationship. It's as if, well, we're willing not to have them criminalised, and we're willing to have them at hospital beds when their partner's dying, And we're willing to give them the pension and the moolah, but we really don't want to make respect for their relationships. And that's got to stop. That is really a wicked discrimination. If we did it on the grounds of race, we would be up in problems. And we've got to get over this. And the sad thing is, when you go to Choggum, you see that the people who themselves were the victims of racial discrimination are often themselves the leaders in discrimination against women on the grounds of gender, and discrimination against gays on the ground of their sexuality. And these things have to change. But they won't change if we all just sit at home and flick the television. You've got to be a joiner, you've got to be involved, you've got to be engaged. It's exciting, it's interesting, and it certainly is worthwhile.
Michael, thank you very much. By the way, my initials are CC and I write in the forward way. One of our outstanding interns of this last period in the AAA's life is Kim, who comes from Wollongong. And she and her mate Jess, who are both students at the University of Wollongong, have been coming up here every Tuesday on the train or by car, long journey, and going back again the same night. And it's an outstanding contribution they've made to this institute. They really have been joiners. And it's Kim who I'd like to call upon to propose a vote of thanks to you.
Thank you, Colin. It is my pleasure to propose a vote of thanks to our highly esteemed guest speaker, the Honourable Michael Kirby. I myself, as I'm sure along with many others, found your statements about the recommendations put forth to the Commonwealth of Nations, such as the better addressing of HIV issues and human rights issues, extremely relevant and thought-provoking. Also, the contrast between a Commonwealth of people and the difficulty we face in obtaining certain visas, I think we would all like to see better addressed by the Commonwealth of Nations. The AAAA New South Wales considers His Honour Michael Kirby one of our most distinguished guests to date, and so on behalf of the AAAA, all of our members and guests, I would like to formally thank His Honour Michael Kirby for your valuable time and insights this evening.